Someone I'd loved for a long time, I found out had betrayed me immensely, and I don't mean infidelity or anything like that, like beyond belief.
No, they're not. That's the thing. If I go down the street, all I get is kids coming up to me. Half of them don't even know who he is. That's why he's got to do songs with Rihanna and Kanye West, so people remember.
A British judge sat in a London courtroom in 2008, looked at both sides of one of the most expensive divorce cases in UK history, and said something that almost nobody talks about anymore. He described Paul McCartney as honest. He described Heather Mills, the woman Paul had married, had a child with, and spent 6 years of his life with, as inconsistent, inaccurate, and less than candid. Heather walked away with £24.3 million anyway. But here's the thing. Years after that courtroom, after the press had moved on and the headlines had faded, Heather started talking again. And what she said this time wasn't about money or settlements or courtroom disputes. It was about something that no financial figure could address, something Paul had carried into their marriage without either of them fully understanding what it would cost. Something that, once you hear it, reframes the entire relationship from the beginning. The house that never forgot her. There is a specific kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't break down in public or ask for accommodation. It just quietly occupies whatever space it's given. The corner of a room, a shelf, a drawer, until the people living alongside it start to realize the space was never really theirs to begin with. When Paul McCartney married Heather Mills in June of 2002 at Castle Leslie in Ireland, he was 60 years old and had been a widower for 4 years. Linda McCartney had died in April of 1998 from breast cancer at 56, after 29 years of marriage. By most accounts, by Paul's own account, her death had undone him in ways that even his music couldn't fully absorb. He had spent the better part of 3 decades barely spending a night apart from her. The silence she left behind was not a small thing. In the immediate years after her death, Paul poured his grief into music, contributing to a choral album called A Garland for Linda and dedicating his classical composition to her memory. He spoke about her in interviews with a rawness that made it clear the loss was not something he had organized into a manageable form. What Heather Mills eventually revealed, in interviews and statements that emerged years after the divorce was finalized, was that the silence hadn't really ended by the time Paul remarried. It had simply been relocated into the walls of the home they were supposed to be building together. The house in question was Paul's property in Rye, East Sussex, a farmhouse where he and Linda had lived for 25 years. It was, by any reasonable description, a monument to Linda, not in an intentional or theatrical way, but in the way that a home becomes when someone has spent decades filling it with the details of their life. There were photographs everywhere, mementos on shelves, personal objects accumulated across a quarter century of a shared existence. And according to Heather, there were plaques, physical, engraved plaques, bearing messages that made the house's emotional center unmistakable. I love Linda, in a home that Heather was now expected to inhabit as Paul's wife. She described the experience as living inside a tribute, not a home, not a space that had made any accommodation for a new chapter, or a new person, or the reality that Paul had in fact remarried. A tribute, preserved and intact to the woman who had come before her. That detail alone would be difficult for most people to process. But Heather didn't stop there. What he was wearing when he proposed. Here is a detail that surfaces quietly in Heather's account, and then refuses to leave once you've registered it. Paul McCartney wore Linda's wedding ring, not his own, but hers, continuously after her death. That is not an unusual form of grief. Many people wear a deceased partner's ring as a way of maintaining closeness, of keeping something physical present when the person no longer is. It is a recognizable and understandable response to loss. Paul had spoken openly enough about how completely Linda's death had altered his daily existence that the gesture made sense in context. Paul wore Linda's ring until the day before he married Heather. Not until he proposed. Not until the engagement was announced, or the venue was booked, or the invitations went out. The day before the ceremony. He removed the ring of his first wife from his hand on the eve of his second wedding and stood at the altar the following morning. Heather's account frames this not as a gesture of closure, but as evidence of a man who had not, in any interior sense, actually closed anything. The ring wasn't a private matter by the time of the marriage. People around Paul knew he wore it, what it signified, and how long he had been wearing it. Removing it 24 hours before exchanging new vows is not the timeline of someone who has processed their grief and arrived at a genuinely new beginning. It is the timeline of someone who has made an external decision while the internal one remains unresolved. That unresolved interior state, according to Heather, was what the marriage was actually built on, not mutual readiness, not two people arriving at the same place at the same time, but Paul at a different stage of his grief than either of them fully understood, and Heather standing in a house full of evidence of that fact from the day she moved in. What made this particularly complicated was that Linda McCartney was not a neutral figure. She wasn't simply Paul's late wife in the way that description implies. She had been a member of his band. She had been photographed by and with virtually every significant figure of the rock era. She had a public identity, a cultural presence, and a legacy that extended well beyond her marriage. Heather wasn't competing with a private memory. She was competing with an icon, one whose image was literally on the walls of the home they shared, and whose name was engraved into the physical structure of that home. Paul's inner circle, by most accounts, never made it easier. Linda had been beloved by people who had known Paul for decades, musicians, crew members, friends who had been part of his world since the Beatles era. These were people whose loyalty to Linda was genuine and long-standing. And Heather, younger, louder, more publicly combative in her instincts, was not received with warmth by that circle from the beginning. There was no gradual cooling. The welcome, by most accounts, was never particularly warm to begin with. Heather was an outsider in a marriage where the interior world already had an established resident. That combination, a grieving husband, a house full of the past, an extended circle that hadn't made room for anyone new, and a legal record of who Linda had been culturally and publicly, created a set of conditions that Heather described, in plain terms, as impossible. She said that Paul's heart had never truly left Linda. That moving on was a struggle he couldn't fully face, despite having made the external decisions that suggested otherwise. Before Paul, who Heather Mills actually was. Understanding what Heather brought to this marriage, and what it cost her when it ended, requires stepping back from the tabloid version of who she was and looking at the actual record. Heather Mills was not, despite how she was frequently portrayed during and after the divorce, simply a former model who married well and complained loudly when it ended. Her life before Paul McCartney had a specific shape that the coverage rarely stopped long enough to acknowledge. She had worked as a model in her 20s, but she had also spent significant time doing humanitarian work in conflict zones, specifically campaigning against landmines, work that had taken her to the Balkans during the wars of the 1990s. In 1993, she was struck by a police motorcycle in London, an accident that resulted in the amputation of her left leg below the knee. She was 25 years old. What followed was not a quiet recovery. She became a prominent advocate for landmine victims and amputees, work that eventually brought her to the United Nations as a spokesperson and earned her a level of public recognition that existed entirely independently of Paul McCartney. She had testified before parliamentary committees. She had organized campaigns and fundraisers. She had written a memoir about her experience of losing her leg and rebuilding her physical life afterward. She had, by the time she met Paul at a charity event in 2001, built a public identity around a cause she had arrived at through her own physical experience of sudden permanent loss. That context matters because it frames what the relationship meant to her and what its collapse represented. This was not someone with no professional standing of her own who had attached herself to a famous man. This was someone who had negotiated significant adversity before Paul entered the picture and who entered the marriage with, as it turned out, a set of emotional expectations that the marriage was structurally unprepared to meet. They had moved quickly. From their first public appearance in January of 2000 at her birthday party to their marriage in June of 2002 was 18 months. Their daughter, Beatrice Millie, was born in October of 2003. her name chosen to honor both Heather's late mother and Paul's beloved Aunt Millie, a gesture that suggested, at least at that point, a real investment in building something shared. From the outside, it looked like a love story finding its footing. From the inside, according to Heather, the footing had never been solid. The fights started early. One incident during their engagement, the specifics of which became public through the court proceedings, involved an argument so heated that Heather's engagement ring ended up thrown out of a hotel window. Staff reportedly had to search the grounds with metal detectors to recover it. That's not a story about a couple having a difficult patch. That's a story about two people who had arrived at a breaking point before the wedding had even taken place. It also raises a question that sits underneath the whole account. What were they fighting about that early, with that kind of intensity? Heather's answer, consistent across her various telling of the story, was always the same. The divorce that exposed everything. The divorce proceedings between Heather Mills and Paul McCartney, which formally concluded in March of 2008, generated more column inches than almost any British divorce in recent memory. Most of the coverage focused on the financial settlement, £24.3 million, which sounded enormous in isolation but represented a fraction of what Heather had originally sought, and a fraction of Paul's estimated net worth, which by that point was reported to be in the region of £800 million. The gap between what she asked for and what she received became its own storyline, framed largely as evidence that her claims had been rejected by the court. What received less sustained attention was the texture of what came out during those proceedings, the specific details that surfaced in court documents and statements, and that painted a picture of a marriage in significantly more trouble than either party had publicly acknowledged while it was still intact. Both sides had made serious allegations. Both sides had lawyers presenting their version of a shared history that each party remembered differently. The courtroom became a space where two people attempted to establish, under oath, which version of their marriage was the true one. Justice Hugh Bennett's judgment was unusually direct for a family court ruling. His assessment of Heather's credibility, inconsistent, inaccurate, less than candid, was not diplomatic language. It was a formal finding that she had not been a reliable witness in her own case. That finding colored everything else that came from her side of the proceedings and gave the coverage a frame that was largely unfavorable to her. Paul, assessed as honest by the same judge, emerged from the courtroom with his reputation broadly intact. But courtroom credibility is a specific and limited thing. It measures how consistently someone presents their account under cross-examination, under pressure, in a formal adversarial setting. It does not necessarily measure the truth or falsehood of the underlying emotional experience. Heather may have been a poor witness in the legal sense, while still having had a genuinely impossible experience in the marital one. What the proceedings confirmed, regardless of which account was more accurate in its particulars, was that the marriage had deteriorated comprehensively and early. The couple had separated in 2006, less than 4 years after the wedding. The formal divorce wasn't finalized until 2008, meaning the legal untangling of a marriage that had lasted roughly 4 years took nearly 2 years of its own to complete. That disproportion is its own kind of statement about how entangled and contested the separation was. Beatrice, their daughter, was 2 years old when her parents separated. The court arrangements for her care, including agreements about schooling and childcare costs, were built into the final settlement. Paul agreed to cover her educational fees and related costs until she turned 17. That provision, quiet and practical amid the noise of the financial figures, was where the real human weight of the whole proceeding sat. What Heather actually exposed, and what it means. Strip away the settlement figures, the courtroom findings, and the years of tabloid noise, and what Heather Mills was actually describing when she spoke about her marriage to Paul McCartney was something quieter and more specific than a bitter divorce. She was describing a man who had not finished grieving when he remarried. That is not a scandalous claim. It is not an accusation of bad faith or malicious intent. Paul McCartney had lost his wife of 29 years to cancer in 1998. Linda had not been a peripheral figure in his life. She had been its center. They had met in 1967 at a London club, married in 1969, and from that point forward, had barely spent a night apart. Paul later said the number of nights they had slept in different places over nearly 3 decades could be counted on 2 hands. That is not a marriage. That is a complete merging of 2 lives into one shared existence. The way he talked about her publicly after her death, in interviews, in the music he made, in the dedications attached to his recordings, none of that reads like someone who had privately moved on while publicly performing grief. It reads like someone who was genuinely and profoundly lost without her. He once described waking up the morning after she died and reaching across the bed. That image, offered in an interview and quoted widely afterward, tells you everything about the scale of what he was managing. What Heather's account suggests is that the grief, which was entirely understandable and real, had not receded enough by 2002 to make room for another person to actually live inside the space it occupied. The house in Rye wasn't a failure of taste or sensitivity. It was a physical record of how much of Paul's interior world was still with Linda. The ring worn until the eve of the wedding wasn't a gesture of transition. It was evidence that the transition hadn't fully happened. The circle of friends and collaborators who hadn't made space for Heather weren't simply being protective of Paul. They were operating inside a world that still had Linda at its center and hadn't reorganized itself around his new reality. Heather described feeling like she was competing with a ghost. That phrase has become attached to her account in a slightly dismissive way, as if it reflects her own insecurity rather than an observable set of conditions. But the conditions she described, the plaques, the photographs, the ring, the house that had been a shared home for 25 years and was now being shared with her, were not imagined. They were the actual physical environment of her marriage. The secret, in the end, is not a scandal. It does not reveal a hidden cruelty or a deliberate deception. What Heather Mills finally and plainly said was that Paul McCartney had never really left Linda, not in the ways that matter when you're trying to build something new with someone. That he was, in all the interior senses, still there. Still in that house, still wearing that ring, still in a grief that had been too large and too genuine to simply set aside because time had passed and a new person had arrived. There is something worth noting about what happened after the divorce settled. Paul met Nancy Shevell, a New York businesswoman, in 2007, and they married in 2011 at Marylebone Town Hall, the same location where he had married Linda over 40 years earlier. That choice of venue, deliberate or not, says something about how Paul relates to his own history. He doesn't escape it. He brings it with him. He wrote a song for Nancy called My Valentine, which appeared on his 2012 album, and it is a genuinely tender piece of writing. He found something real again. But even that story begins at the address where Linda's story began. For a man whose public image rests so completely on warmth, on love, on the romantic generosity that runs through 50 years of his music, that is, in its way, the saddest possible thing to reveal. Not that he was cold, not that he was cruel, but that he loved so completely once that he couldn't find his way back from it in time, and that someone else paid the price for that. Heather paid it financially. She paid it reputationally. She came out of that courtroom with the judge's words about her credibility attached to her name permanently, and she spent years afterward fighting a press narrative that had largely already decided who she was. Whether she handled any of it well is a separate question with a complicated answer. But the thing she said about Paul, that his heart was never fully available to her, that the house and the ring and the circle of people around him had never stopped belonging to Linda, that part has the ring of something true. And that is the thing nobody talked about when the settlement was announced. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.